great to partner to bring you this amazing Times Talk sponsored by the New York Times, which provides all the lunch. About this Times Talks about cancel culture by Dr. Donnette and Brittney Squire. So enjoy and thank you guys.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming today. I am Dr. Noble. Just briefly, faculty in the Leadership Studies Department, and then I serve as the Director of Civic Learning and Engagement at the university as well. So anyway, we're happy to be here today. And I just want to warn you, I have a phone in my pocket which is on because there's a family crisis unfolding a few hundred miles away and I may need to take a call. So if I do, I'll toss it to Brittney to take over. So welcome, yes. We want to talk about calling people into conversation today. So what is the problem? Part of the problem is there is just so much incivility in our world. And this quote over on your right, as you face it, from 1997 did come out of the New York Times, but incivility in partisan politics and government is as old as the Republic. So we've been dealing with this for a long time. And I have a chart here with the 10 consequences of incivility. And you can see that there is a lot. We have bullying in person and online. We have harassment of all types, violent behavior, hate crimes, intimidation, threats, intolerance. I mean, this list is quite lengthy and it's not complete, certainly. And this is provided by Weber and Shandwick. They were doing some annual surveys for quite a long while, tracking incivility in America. So, they're really watching some trends with this over time. Okay, now we want to talk about the effects of social media on civility. And I love this chart. You can see here in the middle is the category for more negative than positive in terms of the impact of social media on our society. And then this breaks it down in interesting ways. We have total Americans over here in this column. Then we have it by gender, men and women. I need to get rid of my pointer. I'm just going to come up and do this so I don't advance my slides. So then over on this side, we have it by generation. And you can see that there are some consistencies among gender and among generational. Probably the biggest differences, though, are between millennials and boomers when it comes to whether or not they feel that this is having a profound negative impact on our society. But as you can tell from these charts, most people agree that this is a problem and it is driving a lot of incivility. But what else about the media? It's not just social media. And this is an interesting, I think, factoid. In 1938, E.B. White wrote an essay, and you know him from Charlotte's Web, I'm sure, and other publications. But in his essay, he was a real critic of media, and he talked about the impact of television and how that would really test our world and test people's perceptions of reality. Aside from that, there are some other interesting dynamics we've seen as media and technology has unfolded. Milton Berle might be a name that some of you younger folks are not familiar with. But he was a very popular entertainer in 1942, and you have to remind yourself that television was still in kind of the embryonic stages in the 30s and 40s, and not everybody had access, but there was more access in the Northeast in urban areas. So, for example, in New York City, when his show started airing on NBC in 1942, theaters and restaurants in New York just saw a collapse of business because all of a sudden people started staying home. They were watching their TVs. They weren't getting out and going to the theater and having conversation and dining with friends. So we've really seen some changes over time with media and how it has impacted our society. And now we're at that point in time where we have a lot of consumers of information who are not necessarily savvy consumers of that information. There are people who are really having trouble discerning the difference between, for instance, entertainment television, and like talk shows on cable networks that have an agenda, and actual journalistic reportage. How do people discern the difference between fact and fiction? Is a problem. That media literacy is a problem in our nation currently. So here, in addition to the problems with media literacy and the way technology has changed our interactions with one another, changed our experiences, increased the amount of incivility that we experience, we've got all this noise going on. I mean, we have content just coming at us constantly, and these are all titles of articles, of blogs, of op-eds in the New York Times fairly recently, and there's just so much negativity in our world, and it's really overwhelming for a lot of people. How do we process this? Because day to day we're hearing about issues with gun violence and hate crimes and other crimes and protest and ugliness and hateful language and awful rhetoric. So it's pretty darn overwhelming, and the consequences of this are not good. What is happening is all over our nation, more and more, we are seeing these civic deserts crop up. And civic deserts are places where people do not have access to opportunities. There's a decline, when people live in these civic deserts, so there aren't services available for them. They are more isolated, so there's not a lot of social interaction and opportunities for education or other things. Maybe there aren't jobs in that particular area that can support a family or individuals. But these civic deserts that are popping up all over the country in just increasing numbers, we've determined that there are a whole lot of negative outcomes as a result of these civic deserts. We have a situation where these things are particularly negatively impacting marginalized and disenfranchised populations, people of color, other minorities. But in addition to that, we're seeing these deaths of despair that are increasing. We have suicide, we have drug addiction, we have this opioid crisis, we have increased alcoholism and liver disease and death by alcohol. And additionally, fewer people are attending faith-based entities, so there isn't that social interaction. And so we've seen this trend over decades that we're just like shrinking more into ourselves and we're not interacting as much with other people. It's impacting our health as well. Life expectancy in the United States has dropped in the last couple of years, and of OECD nations, we have some of the worst health outcomes in the United States. Just a list of problems. Oh, okay. I was about to go, I think, to the next slide. But we'll get there in just a minute. So sorry about that. Oh, okay. So I will try to gently advance this. So what are we going to do about it? So we have an idea, and this is an idea of Professor Loretta Ross. She's at Smith College, and she thinks we need to start calling people into conversation. We have created a culture now when people see something that angers them, or they see someone doing something that they don't think is right, or they hear somebody say something that they don't agree with. What do? They go into attack mode. They start attacking people, humiliating people, calling them out publicly, and what does that do? All that does is create more alienation, more anger, more consternation, more discord among people. So what she says, and she's a really interesting woman, she's a Black radical feminist activist, and she has been out on the leading edges of civil rights and human rights for quite a while. And so she thinks what we need to do is just take a step back, and when we hear things, we don't embarrass people, we don't attack them, we don't issue all sorts of public posts, creating more problems. But we invite them into a conversation. Tell me why you feel that way. Where did that information come from? Let's talk about that. Let's share. And so just really creating that space for people to extend grace, to be kind, to be respectful, and actually learn and grow from one another. And she's really done some beautiful work in this area. And she teaches some classes that are pretty controversial. One is the reproductive justice course, and the other one, white supremacy in the age of Trump. And she warns students, if you need trigger warnings, please, she urges them to drop the class, because she thinks, triggers, having trigger warnings is really not helping people, because they're avoiding conversation, when in fact we should be teaching people how to have those difficult conversations. How can you disagree with someone and do so respectfully and do it with kindness? And maybe there's a space where you can actually learn something for yourself in that process. So instead of being ugly and nasty and hateful and unkind and disrespectful, teaching people to engage in those really meaningful and impactful conversations, because that's the space where we need to come together to actually problem solve and think of ways that we can make things better instead of just continuing to allow things to erode.
Okay, so when we talk about this idea of calling people in, what we're really talking about is civility, so courtesy and respect for one another. So according to that report that Donnette referenced earlier, 9 that you can disagree with one another in a